God takes over, and I'm blown away, and I realize that God can and will use people if they're willing to be, willing to let Him.
Worship in itself, as we said, it comes from the heart. While there's a wrong way, there's not one right way to do it.
But I definitely believe when I step aside and don't rely too much on my own ability, that just amazing things happen.
It's another week of Inside the Bible, a weekly podcast with spiritual insights on biblical truth. Welcome, my name's Andrew Winman, and once again, we continue in our story with the life of Sampson. But this week we're going to start off, instead of going directly into the book of Judges, start out with a verse that correlates with this story very well. Because this story begins, in a way, Samson's, quote, ministry. At about the time Jesus started his ministry, he started his ministry of righteousness. Samson takes a wrong turn, though. He plays a bit on the edge, tries to be a bit risky with his lifestyle. We remember at the time that Jesus started his ministry, he went to the wilderness fasting, and temptation came to him. It's not that he went to temptation, but temptation came to him, and when temptation came to him, he was prepared to combat it. But in this instance, Samson himself decides, hey, I'm going to play on the edge, and I'm going to go to where temptation is. Because you can say in a way that he lets his might, his muscle, get to his head. A gift that was given to him as a blessing from God. A gift that he was anointed with above all things. But as it says in the scripture, we ourselves who are in Christ ought to be sober, to be vigilant, because our adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion, walks about seeking whom he may devour. The devil is out there looking to devour any person who is not attuned to his existence. It says in 1 Peter 5:8 that we ought to be sober. That is, to be alert. Be vigilant. Be prepared, because your adversary, the devil is our enemy. It was only about 3 weeks ago that we studied in the book of Ephesians, where Paul says, we battle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, powers, rulers of darkness, spirits in high places. It's the devil who is our enemy. Our devil is walking about seeking who he may devour. And just as a lion, you don't want to come face to face with a lion, you certainly do not want to find yourself in a place where you're face to face with temptation. Take, for instance, fornication. Paul says, flee fornication. Why? Because the power of sin is so great, so powerful, that it can take a person in an instant. And though you turn away the first time, you look a second time. And the next thing you know, you've pursued it because you could not control yourself. Now, how does this correlate with the passage? We left the last passage with the mother bearing the son, calling his name Sampson, son of light. He grew up, the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move him in times in the camp of Dan, between Zorah and Estaol. The Lord was already using Samson. The Lord blessed him with great strength, with great might, and yet what we're about to see here is Samson is ready to live on the edge. Rather than consulting the Lord on what he ought to do with his strength, it becomes his downfall. Yet ironically, God still uses his downfall to bring about a great work later in the story. But before we get too far ahead, it says in chapter 14, Sampson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Timnath, a town he should not have even gone to, because as a Nazirite, it was his responsibility to refrain from indulging in certain lifestyles, from even exposing himself to them. We remember the number one sign of a Nazirite was growing out his hair. But number two, refraining from drinking wine or even eating the grapes of the vine. Number three, not eating of any unclean thing. And there were a list of things that constituted how a Nazirite should live their life. And Samson's already about to live on the edge. He's going to associate with a Philistine girl. And he came up and he told his father and his mother. And he said, I have seen a woman in Timnath, the daughter of a Philistine. Now, therefore, get her for me to wife. Couldn't help himself. A footnote here in my Bible says that his first response to being blessed with the strength from God should have ultimately been to round up his posse and overthrow the Philistines. I don't know how true that is. I don't know if that's the right response that God would have had for him to do. I mean, it does say that the purpose of his strength would be a light to Israel in dark times, to help overcome the dominion of the Philistines. And yet, it may not have been God's timing. Certainly wouldn't necessarily have been wrong. But one thing we can say for sure is that he shouldn't have been in a territory he did not belong. Coming across a woman who looks good to him, who has that appeal. He explores that even more, comes home without skipping a beat, says, Mom, Dad, forget everything you taught me. I want that Philistine as my wife. And the parents' response should have been, son, no. This isn't of God. We won't permit this. God has called you to live apart from those who will not submit to him. But no, they questioned him at first. The father and his mother said unto him, Is there never a woman among the daughters of thy brethren, or among all the people, that you can take a wife of the uncircumcised Philistines? Is there not a person in our culture that would be better than this Philistine? Fair question. And Sampson said unto his father, Get her for me, for she pleases me well. Sin pleases a person well. Seems to have a taste that is so good we can't pass it up. But we look in the book of Daniel, when they're first taken into captivity. And Daniel, as King Nebuchadnezzar is feeding his servants, neglects the food that the king offers because he says, look, the herbs that we grow here, the food we grow here, is much more nutritional and will help us grow stronger. And the king listened to him, and sure enough, it was the right way to go. Ravi Zacharias took that passage, which I'm really just quoting from memory. Perhaps I got a detail a little bit twisted there, but he made the sermon, don't get your first taste of sin. Don't allow yourself to even have 1 second to be able to taste sin. Refrain from it completely. Don't go down to Timnath, where you're bound to see a woman who will lead you down a road that is ungodly, unrighteous, that breaks your covenant with God. Now, was it for the worst? He wasn't living righteously, but it says here in verse 4, Samson's father and his mother did not know that it was of the Lord that he sought an occasion against the Philistines. The Lord was going to use this. It wasn't the righteous way to go. I can imagine that God would have preferred a better way, and yet God can even use our failures, our downfalls, our ungodly decisions to turn things around for the good. It's not an excuse to sin, but God can still rise up an occasion for us to be able to do His good work despite the wrong that we have done. And so God was going to use this because the ultimate goal here is to overthrow the Philistines, right? They're an ungodly, a paganistic nation that has taken a hold of God's people, and now it's time for them to be overthrown. What better way to do it than to provoke Samson, the mighty, to jealousy? And as we will see later in the story, Samson will be provoked to jealousy when wrong comes on his wife and her family. But in the meantime, it was of the Lord that this should happen. God was going to use Samson's lack of self-control for the good. For at that time, the Philistines had dominion over Israel. Now, verse 5, it says, Then Samson went down with his father and his mother to Timnath, and came to the vineyard of Timnath. What was the first thing that we studied about Samson? Not to eat anything of the vine. They said, don't drink strong drink, but they also put it so far to say, don't eat anything of the vine. Why? Is it bad to eat grapes? No. But why even indulge in the source that leads to the temptation that leads to the sin? Just refrain from it. But Samson decides to live on the edge, and as they're walking down to Timnath, they come across this vineyard, and behold, a young lion roared against him. At this point, Samson's parents are far ahead. It's just him in this vineyard, and the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he rent him as he would have rent a kid, tore that lion in two. And he had nothing in his hand, but he told not his father nor his mother what he had done. Getting so close to the place of sin, living on the edge, you're told not to step on the ground where temptation dwells. The temptation of reaching to the vine and grabbing the grape, which a Nazirite was forbidden to eat from, because it associates with wine, and wine can associate with the temptation of drunkenness. Refrain from it. Samson doesn't listen to this. He goes to the land where temptation exists, and instead of being sober, instead of being vigilant, he was foolish. And Satan, as a roaring lion, walked about seeking who he may devour. Overcame Samson, or at least attempted to, the lion did. Now, interestingly enough, the lion was overpowered. And maybe there will be occasions and times where you decide, hey, I'll live on the edge a little bit. Let's get a little bit close to where temptation exists. I'm not bound to stumble. And maybe you'll just stop short of sinning. Put on that inappropriate movie. Put on that inappropriate program. Because, hey, I'm not watching it for the lust. I'm watching it for the other jokes that are included. The clean jokes. I'll just choose not to laugh at the dirty jokes. I'll just choose to close my eyes whenever that scene comes on that's inappropriate. That's called living on the edge. That's called taking a step closer to sin, and you might overcome the temptation at first. But the further you go down the line, the sooner you wind up like Sampson, who at the end of the story, or close to the end of the story, finally, sin got a better one on him when it took away his strength, and he surrendered the secret of his strength. And Delilah cut his hair and took away his strength. The same can happen to us when we try to play around with the borderline of sin. God says, don't even go near it. Satan is waiting for you like a roaring lion, and you might tear that lion in two the first time. But later on, you will stumble by what you did not expect to make you stumble. It's interesting that a woman is physically weaker than a lion, and yet it was a woman that caused Sampson to stumble. Both times. He tore the lion in two, slaughtered Philistines, yet it was a woman that made him stumble. But right now we're talking about his first encounter with temptation. The devil walks about seeking who he may devour. Samson tore the lion in two and did not tell his father or his mother what he had done. Verse 7, and he went down and talked with the woman, and she pleased Samson well. Have you ever toyed with sin and neglected to tell your pastor? Neglected to tell your mother, your father, or whoever it is that you betrayed? Situation arises where you stumble to a lustful temptation. Neglect to tell anybody. Come out of that phase and then tell yourself, I don't think I'll confess this. And what happens? You become like Sampson, who dwelt in the vineyard, tore a lion in two, touched the dead carcass of an animal, an unclean animal, then went down and indulged in conversation and in marital relations with a woman he shouldn't have been getting married to. And neglected to tell his parents how he had sinned. Didn't tell the people who were appointed by God to keep him accountable. And you too might have somebody in your life who God has made and appointed to keep you accountable before him. So when you go down the road of darkness, you can come to them for accountability purposes. Don't put that off. And after a time, he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion. And he took it in his hands, and he went on eating, and came to his father and his mother, and he gave it to them, and they did also eat. But he did not tell them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. Another commandment broken. Another borderline crossed. He was told by God not to touch any unclean thing. Taught by his parents, who should have known better than to lead him down to this place. And now that they've led him down to this place, they themselves are ignorantly indulging in the eating of something that came from an unclean animal. which God commanded them not to touch, not to eat from, but to be set apart from. And it's interesting that Samson overcame the temptation, but his return to it was only a result of him ever being there in the first place. So you put on that inappropriate video. Decide, hey, I'll listen to the clean jokes, ignore the dirty jokes. Then over time you think to yourself, maybe it's not a big deal if I indulge in some dirty humor. Come back to it. You go to your local gas station. Hey, I'll buy a little bit of wine. Maybe a little bit more wine wouldn't be so bad. And the next thing you know, you wind up at the bar. I'm not saying drinking wine is a sin. I'm saying the temptation can lead to sin if you yourself don't know when to say no. And Samson, knowing full well that he was commanded by God to stay away from the vineyard, definitely overcame the lion, as many of us overcome temptation, but then we return because we lived so close to the edge. And we take from that carcass and we try to eat from it what has been made impure. And that is where he's guilty of sin. The fact that he began by living on the edge, coming too close to where sin can have its temptation, where sin can have its appeal to him. So his father and his mother went down unto the woman, and Samson made her there a feast. For so used the young men to do. And it came to pass, when they saw him, that they brought him 30 companions to be with him. We will pick up the rest of the story in the coming week, Lord willing. I'll leave it at that lesson today. The result of coming close to sin. Living on the edge. Much like the story of the child who was put to bed by his mom. His mom went downstairs, was reading the paper. She hears a thump, comes up, sees him on the floor. She says, "What happened?" He says, "I guess I stayed too close to where I got in." You would have been in a good place had you stayed away from the edge, from the borderline. But you got too close and it caused you to stumble. Don't go near where the source of temptation exists. There's another story that years ago J. Vernon McGee told of a child who was creeping downstairs. Got 2 feet from the cookie jar. His mom calls down, "Jimmy, what are you doing down there?" He stops, thinks for a second, calls up and says, "I'm fighting temptation." And that's not where you want to be fighting temptation. Don't get so close. Don't get close at all. The slightest sight, smell, the things that your ears hear, it's those things that can affect the mind and affect the heart. Don't live on the edge where temptation can have its way with you. May the Lord bless and keep you this week in the way you should go. Until next week, God bless.